My wife and I argue, and it's always about the little things. She drives me crazy, and I just don't know what to do. How do I fix this in my marriage?
Welcome to the Husband's Coach's Corner, the podcast that teaches husbands how to love their wife every day and become better men in the process. I'm your host, Chris Scott, aka The Husband Coach.
Welcome back to the Husband Coach's Corner. We are now in season number 2, and we're starting off this season with questions I have seen posted over the internet, or they've been emailed to me. And of course, some of the questions are just the ones that I've asked myself in my reflection time and things of that sort. Now, before we get too far into the episode, if you are eligible to like, review, comment, all that good stuff on whatever platform you're listening to this episode on, please do it. It just helps this episode land in the hands of people who are looking for this type of content. So if you find value in it, please give it a like or a rating, whatever it is that you can do on the platform you're listening. And if you are looking to get a journal that will help you learn how to see your wife and how to love your wife, then check the show notes. By joining the email list, you get a free guide that I use personally, and I have been updating it. I'm actually troubleshooting a few things inside of it before I release version 2. So in order to get that, you just got to be a part of the email list, and then I send that out to everyone. But for signing up, you get a free version of it, and it comes to you just as soon as you sign up. So check that out. Now, getting into today's conversation, I do want to throw out, just a few guidelines. One, small arguments, they keep coming up and you don't know why, and you're here trying to figure out, how do I fix these small arguments? And then 2, these arguments drive you and your wife crazy, right? Which is why you're looking for the fix. We typically don't try to fix something that is, obviously not broken or whatever, or that doesn't drive us crazy in some sort of fashion. But really, you're looking at this and you're like, there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. Well, let me be the first to tell you, small arguments in marriage are inevitable, and it's actually a sign of a good and healthy marriage. It is 100% okay to have a disagreement with your wife. The Disney Channel, or, Disney in general, has made it out to be like, oh yeah, you get married and you live happily ever after. And that's great in the fairy tales, but in real life, that's not how it works, because ever after is not always happy. Life happens, and there are circumstances that we have to deal with. Some things we bring upon ourselves, and other things just kind of happen as a circumstance of life. So you're going to run into these issues in your marriage, and that's okay. These little arguments that we're discussing today, right? It is okay, and we're going to come up with some ways of, first, identifying what triggers these arguments. Second, we're going to talk about how you can respond when you're in the middle of these arguments, right? Because sometimes they just come up out of nowhere. You're driving down the road and you happen to look out the window and you see a female walking by, and your wife's like, oh, is she cute? And you're like, whoa, wait a minute, time out. Like, that's entrapment. And if you're a sarcastic person, you'll be like, yeah, she's cute, right? And sometimes you might be like, hey, no one is better looking than you. And however you respond to that, obviously, your wife, and if you don't, then you should get to know your wife and how you should respond to her. But moral of the story, these arguments, that's a small one that can turn into a big one. That's that. But you weren't having an argument initially, and then out of nowhere, your wife asks you the question, and next thing you know, she's yelling at you and maybe smacking you upside the head. And you're like, whoa, how did we just get here? We were just supposed to be going to the grocery store to pick up a gallon of milk or something, And I say that because it has happened. And I'll share that story a little bit later. Anyway, all right, it has happened to me. And then we're going to wrap this all up in today's episode with our reflection questions. We are changing up the drills just a little bit. I'm going to give you some drills. As I was sitting down looking at season 2, how do I want to approach the drills? I think that there's some value in discussing them in depth inside of the episode. So let's go ahead and just dive into the first one. How do we identify what triggers these small arguments? So here's what you're going to do. You're going to need to grab a sheet of paper. You don't have to do it right this second, but when you're ready to analyze what triggers these small arguments, you're going to need something to write this down. Because for some reason, things stand out a lot more when you write it down, and you can like highlight or circle or, underline, whatever it is. But the first thing that you're going to write down is your most recent arguments. Only focus on 2. I don't think you need more than 2. You could go with 3 if you absolutely had to, but definitely focus on 2. And you need 2. You can't focus on just 1. All right. You need to have 2 so you can contrast between them, and that'll happen naturally. All right. So after you've written down your argument, so one argument could be, my wife and I argued because I didn't take the trash out and the house started to stink. Like, is that going to end your marriage? Probably not. It's like, all right, hey, I'm going to take the trash out. But your wife is obviously frustrated about this, and that led to some sort of yelling. And, that's what we're talking about today. I guess I should have clarified that. These are small triggers that lead to some sort of frustrating argument. That's what we're talking about. All right. So you didn't take the trash out. Your wife is upset because now the house smells like trash. Are you going to get a divorce over that? I doubt it. But is this something that we should analyze? Absolutely. And we'll talk about that. So write 2 of those types of arguments that you and your wife have. Write those down. Then you're going to write down what your wife said that stood out during those arguments. So write down key words or phrases that you heard your wife say. All right. Now, if you literally like check out every time your wife starts yelling, then you're going to need to pay attention when we get to the how do I respond to these arguments. But assuming you did not check out and you heard what your wife was saying, go ahead and write down those things that you heard her say that really stood out to you. All right. And then the last thing that you're going to write down underneath what your wife said, or to the side, however you want to organize your notes. There's no right or wrong way of this, right? Just writing it down on a sheet of paper. But write down what you said during those arguments. It's important that you account for what you say. Most of the time, when there is an escalation in an argument, it's typically from us, right? As the husband, as the man. We have a way of either bringing a sense of calm to our wife or a sense of frustration to our wife. And a gamut of things in between. But typically, the conversation elevates or escalates when we say something stupid. And it's not that you're stupid, and it's not that the things that you think are stupid or anything like that. But we happen to just say things sometimes without filtering it. Like, okay, how will this be received by my wife? Now, we're right now just trying to identify triggers, but it's important that we understand what we say, because sometimes what we say may have been the trigger of the circumstance. And a bonus thing that you should write down, what did you do, right? Or what didn't you do? Those are kind of the same. Sometimes an argument is spun by what you did, and sometimes it's spun by what you didn't do. It's an unmet need, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. But what you're going to do now that you have these 3 to 4 questions, or at least the answers to these 3 to 4 questions written down, we're going to analyze that information to see what could be the trigger in this circumstance. In many cases, it will be the lack of something being done or not being met, as I've already mentioned. Take some time to really think about this. It may not be obvious at first. Sometimes you may have to take a day or two just to unpack, okay, what keeps triggering these things? Now, if you're hearing this episode, I'm sure you have an idea, and that's okay, because that gives you a place to start. But you have to go and test your theory on those ideas, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So this is a great drill to do with your wife as well. I know that many of the things that I teach here on the Husband Coaches Corner are very geared towards husbands, but look, guys, my goal is to help you become more intimate and building confidence and trust in your marriage with your wife. Some of these drills are really universal. I just spend a lot of time fine-tuning and focusing on husbands, but definitely you can do this drill with your wife. And don't be afraid to share what's going on here, right? Because if you can't talk to your wife about the situations that are going on, you're going to have a really challenging time in your marriage. So feel free to do this drill with your wife, or you both do it separately and then you come together and talk about it. So there's that. Now, once you figure out what your trigger is, based off of the situations that you wrote down, all right, now you can actually do something about it. And this is where you have to take this theory, okay, I think these are the triggers. My wife was upset about the house smelling bad because, one, we don't like a stinky house. That's probably somewhere in there. But two, because she asked me to take the trash out potentially. And, in that conversation or in that argument, she'll probably say something like, last night I asked you to take the trash out. One of the things that comes up common in the relationship with my wife and I is the coffee pot constantly needing to be set early in the morning. We both wake up early, but she likes the way that I make coffee. And it's not that she can't make coffee. It's that she expects me to set the coffee pot every night. And I forget to set the coffee pot. Not going to lie. Sometimes I just, it's like, all right, I'm ready to go to bed. I go upstairs, I get into bed, I go to sleep, and the coffee pot isn't set. Now, it's usually like a microaggression, that response that I get from my wife. If you're not familiar with microaggressions, it's more like, hey, it would be nice to have some coffee. And it's like, oh, well, and I'll be honest, sometimes my response is, you know how to make coffee, so if you don't have it, that's your fault. That is not always the best response, but when we're talking in the spirit of small arguments, that's typically where we like to go, right? And we're going to get into how do I respond, because I will explain why that's not the best response that you can give in this situation, especially if you are buying into what I told you earlier, which I hope you are, that we can bring peace or we can bring frustration in our wives, and we have that ability. It's actually kind of amazing. Now, I want to note that this drill can work for larger arguments, but the drill of the questions that we just asked, But today we're focusing on the smaller arguments, like the examples that I gave, right? You left your clothes on the floor again is another one. That could be an argument in some houses. The unmet need there is probably cleanliness or organization, something that you probably already know about your wife. But if you don't, and I do, I guess I am making this argument or this podcast centered around your wife is triggering the argument, or at least your wife is bringing forth her disdain with your action. But this could be a vice versa thing. Maybe your wife left the clothes on the floor and you are arguing with your wife, and how do you fix this? And the same thing applies. You're going to ask the exact same questions. You're going to write down the exact same answers, and you're going to go into the exact same thing applies. None of this really changes. You may have to change the way you view it, but overall, the same questions apply. All right. And then, or why won't you close the cabinets when you're done getting stuff out? That seemed to have, when my wife and I were younger and in our marriage, we had a lot of that going on. I was always going behind her, closing cabinets. And I remember slamming the cabinets sometimes, just to get her attention. Like, hey, look, I'm closing a cabinet for you again. I don't know what it is about open cabinets that like trigger me. I really need to analyze that. But if I walk in the kitchen and there's an open cabinet, I am moved to close the cabinet. And at times, I want to know who left the cabinet open, because I want to tell that person to close the cabinet. But that's just me. I don't know. Maybe you feel the same way. But nonetheless, I know now how to better address that situation. It does not, let me be very clear. Just because I know how to address the situation better does not mean that I always address the situation better, because at times I'm a human. I have emotions, and sometimes they do get the better of me. However, today we are going to assume that everyone is looking for the way of addressing the situation before their emotions get the better of them. And when your emotions do get the better of you, we're going to talk about that a little bit, but I just want to also put that disclaimer out. All right. So let's move into the how do I respond to these arguments? Now, this is obviously going to be after you have already gone through you're driving along, your wife says, oh, she looks cute, doesn't she? And then you're in this circumstance, right? And you said something like, yeah, she does look cute. And now your wife is upset, right? What do you do, right? Now, this is going to be tough for some of you out there. I'm not going to lie. This is going to be a tough one. You're going to have a humility check. All right. What does that mean? That means you're going to have to be accountable for what you said. So if you don't want to be held liable for saying something stupid, don't say something stupid. Don't say the first thing that comes to your mind. In most cases, at least take a second or two to think about what you're about to say. So you're not going to offend your wife or upset her, because, in that situation, now my instant response is no one is more beautiful than you. That's my instant response. I don't even have to think about it. When my wife plays the silly game, like, oh, what you looking at over there? Or, she looks good, or you think she's cute. No one looks more beautiful than you. And, if she asks me the question, what are you looking at over there? I just look at her and I say, I'm just observing the world around me, and then she says, well, do you see something you like? And then I'll look right at her and I'll be like, I'm looking right at the thing that I love. And that it sounds corny and cliche, but guys, if you want to diffuse a situation, there you go. You're welcome. That's like some James Bond tactics of situation diffusal. Anyway, in many of these small arguments, you're going to believe that your point is the most valid, and it will be easy to dismiss your wife's feelings. And that's what I did with the coffee, right? My wife, she had the microaggression of, it'd be nice to have some coffee. And then it's like, well, you don't have coffee because you didn't make it. You know how to make coffee. That is me dismissing her feeling. And I am not meeting her at the unmet need. It is kind of my responsibility to make coffee. So I will also offer up to you, if you are running into small arguments over things that are your responsibility, you have to take ownership of the portion that you failed at or that you lacked in. So like for me, it's my job to make the coffee, or it's like I didn't like sign a paper saying I apply to be the coffee maker. But because I used to get up earlier than my wife every day, coffee was always made when she got up. So it just became that thing. So now that she's getting up earlier, she expects to have coffee when she gets up. And so that's essentially what happened. And we did discuss that. And I don't think that it was worth us having tension, because all I have to do is put some coffee grinds inside of the filter and put a bucket of water or whatever, some water into the thing and hit a timer to go off at 4:30. So it's easy. But here's the deal. Here's what you don't want to do. When you are in these circumstances, what you don't want to do, you don't want to dismiss your wife's feelings. So instead, when an argument starts, be quiet and listen. That's it. Just shh. Be quiet and listen. Hear what your wife is saying, and don't assume you know what she is saying. Because the truth is, we are often wrong. Now, you've heard me say this many times, and I am a huge believer of sometimes you just got to repeat the things that make the most sense. This is one of those things that I have to repeat because it makes the most sense. You most likely will not agree with what your wife is saying, at least initially, and maybe even never on this particular topic. So your wife could go on and on. She could say some things, and you may not initially agree with what she's saying or ever agree with what she's saying. But here's the deal. Going back to bringing peace, the simple act of you hearing what your wife says and not cutting her off and not trying to be authoritative over the situation and not trying to be, the most dominant person because your word is the law, you're going to bring a level of peace and security to the situation. Even if your wife is yelling and screaming, and again, this can go into larger arguments, but we're talking about the small ones. You can bring a level of peace just by hearing what she says and responding to her in love as opposed to sarcasm, because sarcasm, guys, if you're out there and you think sarcasm helps your marriage, you are sadly mistaken. Even if you have a sarcastic wife and you use sarcasm, very rarely is, especially in arguments, like in conversation in passing, maybe you'll be fine. But if you guys are having a disagreement using sarcasm, that can be another, that's like a solvent, right? It only takes someone to perceive that the wrong way one time, or, however, just to perceive that the wrong way. And now you are in a deeper argument. And it's all because you said something stupid or sarcastic. So if you use sarcasm, make sure that you're using it wisely. All right. Now, next thing that you have to do when you are in these arguments is you got to check your emotions and make sure that your tone is not overly aggressive for the conversation that you guys are having. I'll be honest, I'm guilty of this one at times. I get a little passionate and I get a little over aggressive with something simple like, will you cut the excess mesh off of the mosquito net? I put a mosquito net up outside so we can have a nice little covered porch or whatever. And I left some excess and my wife asked me to cut it because it was not aesthetically pleasing to her. And I did not feel like cutting it because I thought there was a functional need to have a little bit of a tail on it. She did not agree with that. And I got a little bit more passionate with my response than I needed to. So I am guilty of this, and I'll be honest and transparent. But at the same time, I know that. And now I take a little bit more time. I've gone back and made amends with my wife about that particular situation. So now my wife and I could have a small disagreement, and that is just the way that life happens, right? You're in it. And now you have to deal with it. All right. So here's the deal. If you are the person that gets way more sensitive and you get like passionate when you start talking to your wife about disagreements, my recommendation to you is speak in small sentences. What does that mean? That means speak in broken phrases, allowing time for your wife to process what it is that you're saying. And also, it allows you time to think about what you are saying and how this is going to be perceived by your wife. You're observing her body language if you can see her, because you want to bring peace. All right. Because if you're here and you're trying to minimize these arguments, you have to bring peace. Right. So, and this is not me saying be passive or be a pushover. If you are getting that message out of this podcast, I want you to, I want it to be clear that that is not what I'm saying. And two, if you need deeper clarification, please send me an email. We can set up a one-on-one. I don't want you to think that I'm saying be passive during these arguments and be a pushover. I actually want you to be an active engager in the conversation, but bringing a sense of structure and security and comfort for your wife, because at the end of the day, she's still your wife. You need to love her. You need to nurture her. You need to hold on to her, right? You need to protect her. And if she doesn't feel that sense of comfort or protection from you, she will go find it in other ways. So in the small arguments, this is an opportunity. Man, guys, this is an opportunity for you to build that up in your wife. All right. To build up that sense of confidence and security. So use it wisely. All right. Now, small sentences, so that way your wife can gather what it is that you're saying. You can think about what you're saying. All right. This takes away the rambling, which, if you've listened to any of my podcasts, I can ramble, or soapboxing, which if I feel very, very passionate, then I really start to get on a soapbox and kind of preach to my wife, right? That is not what you want to do in these arguments. You don't want to take over the argument. All right. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. And then you want to be able to get to a point where you can agree to disagree. This is a really, really good place to get because unfortunately, we're not always going to agree with our wives. Opposites do attract. And at times you will not be able to see eye to eye on certain things. That's just the way it is. And there's nothing wrong with that. Unless, of course, it goes against some of the values that you guys have in your marriage and things of that sort, in which case you really do need to work that out. But most of the time, the cabinets, my wife, if she she does not really have the same disdain with cabinets being left open. If she sees that there's a cabinet left open, then, and she knows that I'm about to walk into the kitchen, she'll close the cabinet. And I don't have to say anything about it. She, you know, I guess what I'm getting at here is she acknowledges that there's something that bothers me, and she knows that there's something she can do to fix it. So she does it when she has the opportunity to do it. However, I, on the other hand, when I see that happen, I could be like, oh yeah, see, you left the cabinet open again. Or I could just say, thank you. Which one do you think is going to win her confidence and trust? I will guarantee by me saying thank you, or I love you, or, you know, something where I acknowledge that she's doing something to make things a little bit less stressful for me. Yeah, I think you get the point. I'm not going to keep driving that home. You get the point. Moral of the story, get to a point where you can agree to disagree. My wife does not care about cabinets being open or closed, but she knows that I do. And she does something to help with my anxiety or my whatever on open cabinets. Now, the last thing that I'll mention about how do you respond when an argument arises. During this entire process of the argument, do not set out to win the argument. Do not set out to win the argument. If you win the argument, you probably lost the relationship. All right? You're not there to win the argument. That is a terrible mindset. All right? It should not be we're having an argument and I want you to see things my way. And your wife should also be in the same category of, we're having an argument and I want you to see things my way. What it should be is, we're having an argument and I want you to understand where I'm coming from. Not that I'm trying to change your mind, which in some cases, you know, because then that's a debate, which that's fine. If you want to debate things, you know, present your case and go line by line and say, okay, this is a better solution. That's sometimes where you have to be. You know, if it's like, hey, we're going to have a dinner party, what's the menu? And you want steak, potatoes, and vegetables, and she wants salad and lasagna, then yeah, maybe you guys are going to have a conversation and debate which one is the most feasible for the dinner party. I don't know. Moral of the story, in an argument where there is a natural disagreement and emotions are flying, don't set out to win, all right? Instead, set out to understand. Learn to hear your wife and identify what triggered the argument in the first place. Responding with words instantly, this is actually a really bad thing in our culture. We feel like we have to respond as soon as there's a circumstance that triggers a response. And that's not true. We do not have to respond immediately. We do need to respond. And I've talked about this in my How Should Husbands Manage Conflict episode. So you're probably already familiar with some of what I'm saying. But we do not need to respond instantly. We should respond efficiently, effectively, and lovingly. All right. Now, what you should be learning, again, is to identify what triggered the argument in the first place, and ask yourself, was it something you said, did, or didn't do that triggered this argument? And then, did you intend to start the argument? You know, this is a good opportunity for you to identify, did I intend to start an argument today? Or was this just a happenstance of miscommunication? Because that's typically where these small arguments come from. You miscommunicate something, or you say something slips out of your mouth that you should have filtered a little bit better. and now you are placed in a situation where you have to have this conversation. Look, if that's the case, then just own up to that. All right. If you intended to, or if you did not intend to start an argument, then you have to make it clear, hey, look, I did not mean to start this argument. Here's actually what I was trying to get across. All right. Even if your wife doesn't receive that message instantly, the moral of the story is you did try to clarify it, and that gives her a sense of, oh yeah, he is trying to clarify it. So that should be worth something there. All right. Now, moving into our final point of today's episode, we want to reflect on the argument and our wife's position in contrast to our own. Now, I've mentioned before that it's important to have some alone time to go and reflect on your thoughts. We don't do this enough as men in general. I think that there are certain men who have like high performance habits and things of that sort that they spend time reflecting on their own thoughts and, their wins or losses or opportunities, all those things. But most of the time in our marriage, we don't really spend time thinking on our thoughts. So if that's not something that you do, I recommend that you find 30 minutes in the day that you can sit in a space that's quiet or, by yourself, whatever, and just really think like, okay, where am I going in life as a man? Where am I taking my family as a leader? And how is my relationship compared to where it was last month, 6 months ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, whatever you want to use. And there's no right or wrong answer to this, by the way. This is just an opportunity for you to say, okay, things are going the way I anticipated, or they're not going the way I anticipated. And now there's an opportunity for me. Like, once you identify the problem, and sometimes identifying the problem can be scary because that means you actually have to do something or own up to something. But once you identify it, then you can develop an action plan. And that's what we're going to do here today. So the small arguments, they tug at a larger problem, all right? And that larger problem is that unmet need. And sometimes that unmet need can be a very simple thing that you can meet. And sometimes it can be a very difficult thing that you may not be equipped fully to meet, either because you don't see eye to eye on the circumstance, or you just don't understand how deep that goes with your wife, right? So if you do well, however, with responding and recovering from small arguments, in your marriage, it can grow and the intimacy can get even deeper. And that's the importance of reflection time. So during your reflection time, here's what I want you to think about. And you don't have to do all of these questions, but I want you to ask yourself some of these questions. And there may even be a good opportunity to just write some of this down as you ask the question. All right. So the first one, did I make an attempt to win the argument? We just talked about that. You don't want to win the argument. All right. If you were making an attempt to win the argument, then you probably were trying to sell your wife that you're right and she's wrong. And when there's an argument going on, your wife doesn't want to hear that she's wrong. In fact, you're better off not even bringing up the fact that she's wrong. Just address what's going on and then ask her what it is that you would like to see happen in the future. All right. The second question, what did my wife say during this argument? This is where I told you stop talking and listen. Don't be quick to respond, be quick to listen, and you will hear what your wife is saying. You may not understand everything, which leads us into the third question. What did she mean? Now, if you don't know, like you're sitting there and you're like racking your brain, you're like, okay, she said this, and I don't know what that means. If you ask yourself that question, or if you answer it and you're like, I don't know what that means, that says I need to go talk to my wife because there's something going on that I don't fully have an understanding or an appreciation of. So then you go and talk to her, and that's why it's important. What did she mean? All right. The fourth question: were my emotions in check during this argument? You have to ask yourself this question. Were my emotions in check during the argument? Because if the answer to that is no, then that means your argument or your emotions need to be really centered and glued in. All right. So just reflect on that. Number 5, could I have handled this differently? Now, that's a self-explanatory question. But what you really want to focus on here is, could I have handled my emotions differently? Could I have handled the initial trigger differently? Could I have handled my response differently? Meaning my verbal response, not necessarily the emotional response or my body language. Maybe that could have triggered it even further, right? Because we do communicate verbal and nonverbal. So how could I have responded to this differently? All right. Number 6, does my wife have a valid point that I can adopt? This is a level of humility, right? It's like, okay, I've heard the argument. Is my wife right on this? Or is there a way that I can meet her where she needs me to meet her to a point that we can be successful together? That is a very hard one for some people to keep up with. All right. But when you humble yourself and you ask yourself this question, does my wife have a valid point that I can adopt? You will probably find that there is some level of validity to what she's saying, and then you can adopt it and try it out. And if it doesn't work, then that's when you and your wife can really come back and talk that over, right? And then the last question that I have for you that you can ask yourself during your reflection time is, how can I close the loop with my wife on this topic? Now, obviously, this is probably after you have asked yourself the first 6 questions. You want to ask yourself, okay, and this is probably the one question that I would say is an enduring question. You always want to ask yourself this at the end of your reflection time when you are looking at an argument. How can I close the loop with my wife on a topic? Or even if it's not an argument, this is a great question. I ask myself this every single day, like, okay, how can I bring value to my wife? How can I bring value to our marriage? And then if there's something that my wife has brought up as a concern, then it's like, okay, let me think about that. All right, how can I close the loop with my wife on this? And, it's not like I spend hours thinking about this in deep thought. Again, I have time in the morning when I wake up and I'm preparing for podcast episodes, things like that. Or even when I'm getting ready for work, because I don't have to write down all of this stuff, right? Sometimes I do like to jot down notes, and I use my wife journal for that. Sign up in the email list in the show notes below. You'll get a free copy of it. Shameless plug there. But I also like to just let my thoughts come to me. And if something strikes me as like, aha, then I will take my phone out and I'll put it into my iPhone notes or my Google Docs or whatever note taking app that I have available, or I'll write it down on a piece of paper and then consolidate that later into my wife journal. But moral of the story is I always ask myself question number 7 when I am at the end of my reflection time, or somewhere in my reflection time, I should say. So hopefully those questions help you out. So let's go ahead and wrap this all up. All right. Again, this episode may take some time to unpack a little bit further. All right. I understand that arguments, they're sensitive and they're not always easy, and you're not always confident. Like, am I in a small argument? Am I in a big argument? Arguments, they can take some getting used to and some time to really build up. But now that you have the information, it's time for you to go and really sit with it. Sit with this in your reflection time, and start with the first drill of writing out the 3 questions about the trigger. Then move yourself into, okay, how do I respond to my wife whenever we're in these circumstances? Because that matters, right? How do I respond to my wife? What are my actions? And then the third point is back in your reflection time. All right, we've had this argument. This is what my wife was saying. This is what I think I was trying to say. And I was not trying to win the argument. I was able to figure out what I could have done differently. And then how do I take this back to my wife and close out the conversation? That's very important. All right. So once you have all that, you can go, and I think you are better equipped with dealing with small arguments. This is not going to make you an expert, and you don't have to be an expert. I think that's very important. You don't have to be an expert to be a loving husband. All you have to do is meet your wife where she is, love her, and that is exactly what I teach here at the Husband Coach's Corner. So if you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and, do all the rating that you can do. Share this with a friend if there's someone that you think would benefit from hearing this message. So until next time, what I want you guys to do is find a way to love your wife every day. Peace.